Tips on group presentations. Let's talk about some important information that you need to know on these group presentations. First, coordinating content. Make sure on these presentations that you don't repeat information, but you do reinforce. One of the biggest problems I see in group presentations is group members who do not communicate clearly with one another. What I mean by that is speaker 2 is up there making her presentation, she's using this piece of information, she's making this major point, she's reinforcing it with research. Meanwhile, group member number 4 is sitting waiting her turn, holding her breath, cringing because she realizes that she has that exact same point, that exact same research, and now she has to make the decision whether or not to completely eliminate the information that she has and not have enough time in her presentation, or whether or not just to speak it and make some sort of crazy apology to the audience of such as, oh, I know you've already heard this, but let me tell you again. So make sure that you don't put yourself in that embarrassing situation. Know what the other speakers are going to say. Know what research they're going to use. Rehearsing your presentation beforehand can be one helpful way to do this. At a bare minimum, you need to read over each other's outlines. Read it, soak it in, know what they're going to talk about. What can be helpful, however, is to reinforce the content of another speaker. What I mean by that is you might say something like, well, Danny was up here earlier and he talked about how in Indian society weddings are very important. He talked about how the show of power and the show of community and the show of importance for a family in a society is not so much in their possessions but in their wedding. Now I'd like to reinforce that and tell you a little bit about how that carries over into business matters, how it makes a difference in the types of gifts that you give to the family, and then about thinking about this individual culture. So you can reinforce, but again, not repeat. Another thing that you can do in coordinating content is to make sure that it's a seamless flow of information, that it looks like you are one project, not 4 or 5 individuals who just happen to be talking about the same topic. One of the ways to do that is to make sure that the first speaker has an interesting grabber that has to do with the content in general, and then they give a preview for the entire group. In other words, they're going to say something to the effect of, today we're going to talk about Indian culture, we're going to talk about how to conduct business, we're going to talk about manners and etiquette, we're going to talk about important clothing choices and how customs will play out in the day-to-day relations when dealing with someone from India. So in other words, it's about everything that all the speakers are going to say, summarized nicely in one or two sentences. The other thing that you can do is to review for the entire group. Have the last speaker summarize what every person has said, again in a nice 1 or 2 sentences. Another important thing you can do is manage transitions well. Each speaker should have a clear review, and each speaker should have a clear conclusion that summarizes, wraps up the information, and gives us something to think about. But after that, there needs to be a lead-in to the next speaker. Now that I've talked about A, Sam will come and talk to you about B and how it relates to this culture. The other thing you need to think about is not just what you say, but how you're going to move. So if one person's leaving the podium and the next person's coming up to the podium, how are you going to do it so you don't run into each other? How are you going to do it so it's not this awkwardness of who goes where? I can tell you a few things that don't work. One thing that doesn't work is for Sam to sit in his chair while Becky says, now Sam's going to come and talk about his presentation. Long pause. Sam gathers his note cards and slowly walks to the front of the room where the podium is, gets his notes out, sets them on the podium, and then begins speaking. By that time, the audience is so gone that it's really hard to get them back. Another thing that doesn't work well. Becky's talking. Sam realizes it's almost his time, so he gets his note cards and he goes and stands directly behind Becky, at which point he's got his note cards in hand, he's reading over them, rehearsing them, waiting for his time to speak. The audience's attention now is turned to Sam. We have no idea what Becky's saying because we're paying too much attention to what he's doing and is he next and how's this going to work, and so that portion of content is completely lost. However you do it, just make sure that it's seamless, that it's not distracting, and that it's well thought out. Timing is very important. For this presentation, you have to have a handout. You have to ask yourself, is it better that I give it at the beginning? Or if I give it at the beginning, is the audience going to be reading it while someone's speaking, and therefore not paying attention to the presentation? And maybe it's going to have to do with a major point partway through. Maybe we need to give the handout partway through. If so, who's going to distribute it? How are they going to distribute it quickly and not obtrusively? Or is it going to go at the end? And if so, how are we going to make that as much of a professional part of the presentation as the speech itself, rather than just, here, pass those down? All of these make a difference in the impression of the audience. Same way with the food. The assumption is the food goes at the end, but that's not always the case. I have had students, for example, one group that talked about China that passed us out partway through the presentation chopsticks and showed us how to use them and gave us an object that we could try to pick up. So when they talked about the importance of using chopsticks etiquette, not to put them on the table, how to use them, we had that prop in hand that enhanced the message that they were doing. But they had to think about the timing and how to get those out to the audience quickly. They also had to not give them to us first thing because too many audience members would be tempted to play with the chopsticks and not pay attention to the presentation. Another thought on timing is, when are slides going to be advanced? Oftentimes groups will make the decision to have one person to be the official clicker, which works fine as long as the clicker knows when he's supposed to advance the slides. Are you going to point? Are you going to make eye contact? Do they just know? The situation you want to avoid is slides being advanced and the speaker have to say, no, we're not ready for that yet. Go back. That's embarrassing and it's non-professional. So make sure that you have rehearsed and planned the timing of when to transfer from one slide to the next and who's going to do that. Arrangement. You need to consider as a group where you're going to sit. You can sit in the regular seats with the audience, or you can arrange chairs to the front in a panel form, looking out towards the audience, waiting for your turn to speak. Wherever you do it, it needs to be planned. You need to think about the flow of motion. How are you going to get up out of your chair? Is there room for you to get to the podium? Or are you going to have to scoot stuff out of the way? You need to think about, again, how you're going to make that motion seamless and professional. You need to think about the person who does advance the slides, whether or not it's going to be each individual person and they pass the clicker on, or whether or not there's one person doing it. Can that person see the speaker, and can they see the PowerPoint where they're seated? Do they need to be able to touch the computer in order to turn on a movie? You need to plan, again, where people are going to stand, how they're going to stand, and so on. The other thing you need to think about is what to do when you're not talking. Avoid being a distraction. Really, I mean this. This can be a real problem. Oftentimes, groups will arrange the entire group at the front of the classroom, and I see one of these individuals, the picker. The picker picks fingernails, earwax, boogers, toes, picks apart pencils, tears paper and makes it in little balls. Avoid being the picker. Avoid being that person that captivates the audience's attention and takes it away from the speaker. The next, the yawner. How embarrassing is it when one group member is speaking and another group member is sitting in the chair yawning? The very face that we see is, gee, I think our presentation's boring. Don't you? Another distractor that I see is the flirter. That's the person who sits up front and doesn't know what to do with their eyes, so they just look out at the audience, smile really cute, sometimes do the coy sideways glance like, look at me, aren't I cute? Yes, yeah, look at me. I'm not paying attention. You can look at me so you don't have to pay attention too. Again, avoid being a distraction. One of the funniest ones I've seen through the years is the hanger. The hanger is that person that hangs off objects. It tends to happen the most when groups make the poor decision that they're all going to stand. They're going to stand during the entire presentation and then one at a time walk to the podium. And inevitably, the hanger will find something to throw their body across. Sometimes they'll stand up at the whiteboard and hang one side of their body on the marker tray. The funniest one I ever saw was a guy who literally laid his entire body across a table with his arms hanging down and his chin propped on the edge of the table. I've seen people hanging across the computer desk with their body draped like they're a tired scarecrow across those. Do not be the distractor. Do not be a hanger. And one of the worst happens is when one of the group members is talking and another member of that same group is sitting in their chair rolling their eyes. So when the speaker says, "The culture in India is very important," the other person rolls their eyes and makes a face like, "That is the dumbest thing I've ever heard anyone say. I can't believe he just said that." So avoid being a distractor. Keep your presentations professional. The skills that we're learning in this translate to the real world in ways that you can't even imagine right now. I'm getting feedback from former students who've graduated my classes who are telling me that one of the most important skills that they are learning is how to make clear transitions between speakers, how to execute a group presentation, because this is what's being used in the workforce right now. As with all things we do in here, it's about being audience-centered. It's about thinking about what will work for my audience. How can I help them understand? How can we keep it seamless and keep it professional? Because we've got important things to say, we have important information they need to learn, and we want to keep the focus on them and what they need and how we can best achieve that, because it really is about being audience-centered.